Love is literally in the air when a cloud is entrusted to carry a message from a lovelorn yaksha to his beloved. SOAS lecturer and Sanskrit expert Dr. Lidia Wojtczak talks to the circle about Kalidasa's genre-defining Meghduta and other messenger poems.
Hi everyone, my name is Lidia Wojtczak. I'm the lecturer in Sanskrit at SOAS at the University of London, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about Sanskrit messenger poetry, Duta Kavya or Sandesha Kavya, which has been one of my main academic interests for a very long time now. So I'm very, very happy to be able to share that interest with you in the Live History India circle. Sanskrit poetry is broadly known as kavya, but when we use the term kavya in Sanskrit, we actually are referring to basically any type of text that has some sort of an aesthetic purpose in mind. And by kavya, we're referring to drama, we're referring to poetry, lyrical poetry and epic poetry, and also to prose. So basically all of a literary production. And the thing about kavya is that most of us consider Sanskrit to be the main medium of kavya. However, it could also be composed in Prakrits and a range of what we call apabhramshas, that is the Middle Indic languages of medieval India. Kavya was supposed to be complicated. It's a very rich and dense type of poetry. It was composed in such a way that it wasn't accessible to everyone. Of course, the language barrier was the first barrier that one had to overcome, but poets used a whole range of difficult grammatical constructions, of difficult vocabulary, unexpected imagery, and what we call kavya conventions. So they really drew on the poetic history that was known to them and to their readers. They used a whole range of figures of speech, what we call alankaras, both figures of sense, like all sorts of types of metaphors and similes, as well as figures of sound, like all types of alliterations and various types of rhyming. Punning was extremely important. So this was a very rich and complicated type of literature. As I've said, it wasn't for everyone, and not everyone could compose kavya. Kavya was composed by kavis, that is, professional poets who spent their whole lives training and practicing their art. And in the same way, it couldn't really be appreciated by anyone, even if that person knew Sanskrit. It had to be appreciated by a professional connoisseur. And in Sanskrit, the word for connoisseur is either sahridaya or rasika. Sahridaya means someone who literally has their hridaya, their heart, in tune with the literary work that they're experiencing. And a rasika is somebody who can literally taste the rasa, the flavor of the poetic work that they are listening to or watching on stage. So these are very important categories to keep in mind, that kavya was not for everyone. It does take a lot of training to become a rasika. Unfortunately, like with most things connected to the history of ancient India, we don't really know much about the very beginnings of kavya, because when it appears to us in historical record around the 2nd century of the Common Era, it's already in a very, very mature state. On the one hand, we've got a stream of kavya that we'll find in the so-called prashastis, the panegyrics that formed part of the inscriptions that were composed for various rulers over the centuries throughout South and Southeast Asia. And these prashastis were very, very often composed in Sanskrit, no matter the language of the actual inscription. It could be a vernacular language like Tamil, for instance. The prashasti very often appeared in Sanskrit and in this kavya style. And this is something that was begun in the 2nd century by the Shaka king Rudradaman, who actually this text is the first Sanskrit text we have available to us that can be clearly dated. And this first Sanskrit text in writing that we possess is actually already a kavya style text. On the other hand, we have a second stream of kavya appearing in the 2nd century, and that is what we might want to call poetry proper. Because in the 2nd century is when the great Buddhist poet Ashvaghosha composed 2 mahakavyas, 2 great poems, as the name suggests, the Saundarananda and the Buddha Charita. And these are already extremely sophisticated, beautiful kavya poems with huge scope. And as a matter of fact, it's actually quite surprising that Ashvaghosha chose Kavya to spread a Buddhist message, because that's what he's trying to do. But he acknowledges this in his own words. At the very end of the Sandarananda, he actually says that the purpose of his poem was not to be pleasurable to his readers, but actually for it to be a pleasurable vehicle to convey this meaning that is liberation. And he actually says, quite like Mary Poppins might 2,000 years later, that this poem format, this kavya format, is the honey that helps the bitter medicine of his teaching become more palatable. So what this tells us, even if we don't really know much about Ashvaghosha and his milieu, is that he was already composing and working in a place where the protocols of understanding kavya, appreciating kavya, and enjoying kavya were already very much in place. So from that 2nd century onwards, we start thinking about kavya as this not only literary phenomenon, but cultural phenomenon, albeit, of course, belonging to the elites. But definitely, that's when it starts to make waves. And again, as with most things in the history of ancient India, we don't have much data following the 2nd century of the Common Era, but everything changes in the 5th century when we find the flourishing of Kalidasa, who was without a doubt the greatest and definitely is now the most famous Sanskrit poet to date. He composed 3 plays, 2 Mahakavyas, and most importantly for us today, the Meghduta, which is a short form poem, but which had perhaps the greatest impact that any literary work has ever had in the history of Sanskrit literature. And that's what we'll focus on today. Let's move on to the Meghduta, which, as I just said, marks a turning point in the history of Sanskrit literature in general. It's a small work, depending on the edition or on the recension that you're reading. It can have 110 to 127 verses, and it doesn't really have much action going on in it. Just to very quickly tell you about the story, it's the story of a yaksha, a kind of celestial being who has messed up at work and therefore has been sent off into exile to the south, to Ramagiri. And he's had to leave his beloved wife, his yakshi, at home in their home in the city of Alaka, which is in the north, and it's the capital of the king of the god of wealth, Kubera. And he's there on the mountain for quite some time, and then the monsoon happens. Now, one thing that's extremely important, an extremely important image in Sanskrit literature, is the coming of the monsoon, because from a practical perspective, the monsoon is when people are supposed to be together, whether it's wandering monks who are supposed to spend the monsoon season in their monasteries, or lovers who are supposed to be together during the monsoon, because basically traveling is impossible. The roads are impassable. It's impossible to get around. So the monsoon is conventionally the time to be with your beloved ones. So our poor yaksha on his mountain in the south sees the monsoon approaching, and is reminded once again of how wretched he is in his position. So he sees one of the huge monsoon clouds as it happens to butt into the mountain that he's staying on, and he decides to tell it to take a message to his beloved wife, because the monsoon, of course, as we know, moves from the south to north on the Indian subcontinent. So he knows that the cloud will eventually have to reach the Himalayas, and so he starts addressing the cloud. He tells the cloud what route it's going to take to reach Alaka. He describes a lot of very fun adventures, like, for instance, the cloud is going to put out some forest fires on the way. It's going to be able to recharge its energies by making love to the beautiful rivers that it meets as it goes north. It's going to be able to mix itself with incense and rest in the rookeries on the very highest towers of this beautiful, marvelous city of Ujjain. So there's a really pleasurable journey that's described to this cloud. And then we zoom in finally to the city of Alaka, and then to the yaksha's house, and then finally we have this imagined delivering of the message. What is really striking in the Meghduta is that there is no happy end. Because if we think about it, nothing in the poem actually ever takes place. The yaksha as he's introduced to us by the poet in the first introductory 5 verses of the Meghduta, is maddened. He has no way of conceiving what is real and what isn't. He's not able to judge reality. And the poet himself, as we'll see in some verses in a minute, the poet himself, or the narrator rather, acknowledges that this cloud, which is just a conglomeration of smoke and wind and water and fire, does not have the ability to carry any type of a message because it is an inanimate object. But the yaksha has completely lost any sense of that. So when the yaksha starts speaking, it's all wishful thinking. He's thinking about what could happen potentially if his imaginations were to come true. We, of course, know that they won't. So while we travel with this cloud through India from south to north to the Himalayas, at the end of the poem, we actually find ourselves quite unhappily at the very same place where we began, with the yaksha, a lovesick man, speaking to a completely inanimate object that is not able to, of course, carry out the mission. So it's a really striking thing that a lot of poets then picked up on. So that is the story of the Meghduta. The Meghduta is by itself responsible for the flourishing of the entire Duta Kavya genre. It's completely unique in that respect in terms of just generally the whole history of South Asian literature, because it inspired dozens, if not hundreds, of messenger poems composed in Sanskrit, but also in vernacular languages and modern languages of modern India. These have been composed continuously from the very moment that the Meghduta appeared. And somehow these poems, in varying degrees, will always make an effort, or the poets will always make an effort to connect their work to the Meghduta in some way. So basically, if you want to think about what is the defining characteristic of a Duta Kavya composed after the Meghduta, we could say that the main defining characteristic would be some type of implicit or explicit connection being made to the Meghduta itself. And that is actually quite remarkable, that this one work, this very short work, if we think about other types of kavyas that we might come across, has had such a huge impact and played such an important social and cultural role. So let me give you some examples of the type of impact that the Meghduta had. So the first thing I want to just note is that it is perhaps one of the most commented on texts in Sanskrit literary history. So perhaps you're aware that a lot of Sanskrit or ancient, let's say, Indian academia was done via the medium of commentaries. You had the main text on which you commented, of course, very often adding your own interpretations to the text and your own thoughts. And then someone else would take your commentary, comment on that commentary, and thus this great machine of Sanskrit academia grew and snowballed. So the Meghduta has, according to some scholars, up to 63 commentaries that were composed in order, theoretically, to explain what's going on in the poem. Now, it is definitely a very complex and beautiful and complicated poem, but it's definitely not a poem that needs to be explained 63 times. Commenting on the Meghduta was something that seems to have been a very sophisticated or very a very sophisticated exercise that was enjoyable to the scholars who decided to write these commentaries. The Meghduta recensions range from 110 verses to 127. So every commentator was maybe commenting on a slightly different version of the text. And while this makes it very difficult for us to decide what the original verses of the Meghduta were, it actually goes to show that there was a huge interest in analyzing the text, in adding to the text, in taking away from the text, because the commentators very often ended up commenting on verses which they decided were prakshipta, that is, they were interpolated verses, added verses. And so they would say, this verse doesn't belong to the original, that one does. So there's a huge discussion happening about what the Meghduta was supposed to mean, but also what form it was supposed to have. And what the place where the Meghduta has the most verses is in the Jain tradition, which is a very interesting locus for the Meghduta. The Meghduta is extremely erotic. There are verses in the Meghduta that might make readers blush even today. So the fact that the Jain poets of the medieval South Asia decided to use the Meghduta in their work is actually extremely important as well. It tells us about the kind of currency this poem had as the main vehicle, I guess, of literary expression in many ways. So, for instance, one thing that the Jains did with the Meghduta, if we can say that, is they used it for a type of a poetic game called Samasya Purana, which is basically this exercise of taking one verse from the Meghduta, which is made up of 4 lines, dissecting the verse into 4 separate lines, and then using one line from the Meghduta as the final line of your own poem. So this means that Jain poets could end up composing really very long works which would incorporate the entirety of the Meghduta in them. The most famous example for this is Jinasena's Parshvabhyudaya, which was composed in the court of King Amoghavārsha in the 9th century. So this is actually our earliest known reuse or commentary on the Meghduta to date. So what Jinasena did in the Parshvabhyudaya is that he took the story of the Meghduta and dissected it in such a way that he managed to create a completely new narrative on the deeds and past lives of the Tirthankara Parshva. And it's actually a really very interesting phenomenon. And generally, Duta Kavyas became extremely popular among Jain poets because they allowed this description of the root, which is an important feature of Duta Kavya in general. And very often it was the Meghduta that served as the basis for these Samasya Purana type poetic exercises. Most poems begin with an introduction of the hero. We learn a little bit about their background, where they come from, their name, who their family is. But the Meghduta begins with the word kashchit. Kashchit means a certain, as opposed to the in English. We might want to say an indefinite article in many ways. So this kashchit means just a certain someone, just anyone, a nameless yaksha, as we'll learn in a moment, which is perhaps a big part of the Meghaduta's charm, because it's about kashchit, it's about anyone basically. It could also be about, of course, us as individuals. So we get this certain sense of connection from that very first word kashchit. Kashchit kanta virahaguruna svadhikara pramattah shape nastang kamita mahima varshabhogyena bhartuh yakshashchakre janakatanaya snana punyo dakeshu snigdha chaya tarushu vasatim ramagiryashrameshu. Another thing about the Meghduta is that it is famously composed in what is known as the Manda Kranta meter. It is a very fixed metrical system that we have in Sanskrit poetry, and the Manda Kranta is also very fixed. It's 4 times 17 syllables, laid out in a very specific type of a rhythm. So all of the verses that we're going to be reading today will be in the Manda Kranta meter. This is the meter that is used basically for all Duta Kavyas. There are exceptions, as we might expect, of course, but the vast majority of Duta Kavyas composed after the Meghduta are composed in Manda Kranta. Manda Akranta meaning moving slowly, walking slowly. What this actually shows is not only how the Meghduta was appreciated for its literary merits, which are basically infinite, but also more importantly, I think, in this particular case, the power that it had over literary circles and that core position that it seemed to have in the Sanskrit curriculum. Because by the 9th century, when Jinasena was composing his Parshvabhyudaya, he could have chosen from any number of other very famous poems and incorporated those into his reworking his own poem, but he chose the Meghduta, and that just goes to show that it was something that everyone was supposed to recognize. It was the poem that would be instantly able to trigger a whole set of connotations that other poems were not able to do at that time. Keeping in mind that this is already 400 years after the Meghduta had been composed, more or less. That's the first verse of the Meghduta. Now let's have a look at how the Samasya Purana works. So as we said, the first line of the Meghduta is Kashchit Kanta Viraha Guruna. That's how the work begins. And let's have a look at the first verse of the Parshvabhyudaya now. It reads, Shriman Murtya Marakatamaya Stamba Lakshmim Vahantya Yogai Kagrya Stimitaraya Tasthicam Samnidadhyau Parshvam Daityo Nabhasi Viharan Badha Vairena Dagdha Kashchit Kanta Viraha Guruna Svatikarat Pramattaha. So we can see that this final line of the first verse of the Parshvabhyudaya is actually the first line of Kalidasa's Meghduta. Here it's completely been reworked, and now instead of applying to a poor yaksha who has become separated from his beloved, it now refers to a demon who has been separated from his beloved and has lost his power. So that's more or less how the Samasya Purana mechanism works. And in the Parshvabhyudaya, Jinasena generally takes one line, sometimes two lines from the Meghduta and incorporates them in his own work. Tasyat sthitva khatamapi purah kautaka dhana hetor antarbashpashchiramanucharo rajarajasya dadhyau meghaloke bhavati sukhino piyanyatha vritti chetah kanthashlesha pranayini jane kinpunardura samsthe. The translation of 1.3 is actually very, very beautiful. Of course, the Sanskrit original is much more beautiful than my translation, but it basically says that somehow or other, the yaksha managed to stand in front of the cloud which causes desire to be kindled. And this yaksha was the servant of the king and kings, and he meditated on this cloud for a long time, holding back his tears. And then we have something which is a very common literary trope in the Meghduta, and that is a figure called Arthantaranyasa, that is the introduction of a new matter or transition, where we have a general truth being explained to us based on the very specific situation at hand. This general truth is that the mind of even a happy man, sukhinaha api chetaha, the mind of even a happy man is maddened by the sight of a monsoon cloud. So what then to say of somebody who has been separated from his beloved and is longing for her embrace? Messenger poetry, like I said, started with the Meghduta. However, although it was being composed continuously from the 5th century onwards, it was on a bit of a slow burn. But around the 14th century of the Common Era, especially in South India, there is an explosion of messenger poetry. In the South, it's generally known as Sandesha Kavya rather than Duta Kavya, but of course it was exactly the same thing, the same genre. And we have an explosion of messenger poems composed both in Sanskrit and in Tamil and Malayalam. And these were extremely important works for the people in those regions. So even though they continued to be composed in Sanskrit, these South Indian Duta Kavyas, they did not have the same cosmopolitan qualities that the more ancient poems had. The Duta Kavyas of South India are more specific. They are more zoned in on the realities and environment of real life people. Very often we have a little bit of a background story presented to us in these poems about how the poet came to compose the Duta Kavya, and even more often we have a very personal description of the journey and a very personal addressee of our message. Very often it's the poet's lover or wife. He describes in the journey, he very often describes places which are very well known to him, people who will be able to recognize him, and who his messenger should say hi to on the way, because they are all very good friends. So there's this there's a very, very important second wave, so to speak, of Duta Kavya production beginning with the 15th century. And that type of Duta Kavya in Sanskrit and also in the vernacular languages of South India continue to be composed till this day, even definitely till the 20th century. There's also a separate strand or a separate type of Duta Kavya composed in Sinhala in Sri Lanka, which had very different qualities. It was not erotic poetry, but because it was influenced by Buddhist thought, Buddhist teachings, it was kind of devoid of the same type of eroticism that Sanskrit Duta Kavya in South India had, but it definitely also belonged to the genre. So Duta Kavya continued to grow, to develop, and we find Duta Kavyas, as I said, being composed in all languages, including Sanskrit, in modern times. A lot of thought has been put into, especially in modern times, into why the Meghduta was so impactful. Because, of course, it is a beautiful literary work. It's quite short, which makes it maybe a bit easier to learn. It does actually form part of the basic curriculum that a Sanskrit student would have had to be introduced to in ancient and medieval times. So basically everyone knew it. But what made it so appealing? Now, of course, we can't answer that question with full certainty, but another element, let's say, of the Meghduta that gives us that makes it so powerful, I guess, is the element that I think I've alluded to a couple of times, and that is the description of the root. So the root that is being described in this messenger poetry can be interpreted in various different ways, can be reused. That idea of the root can be reused in various ways. For instance, very often when a Duta Kavya is composed by a devotional poet, by a poet who is composing a devotional messenger poem, the root itself, as it's being described, very clearly takes on the character of the route of a pilgrimage that the messenger is supposed to take as it makes its way from the sender, who is, of course, the devotee, to the addressee, the god who is usually placed in a particular temple that is very far away and that needs to be reached by the messenger. Arguably, Kalidasa's work does not have much religious content in it. But of course, on the way, as the cloud travels north to Alaka, which is in the Himalayas, and which, as Kalidasa tells us himself, which basks in the light coming from the moon on Shiva's head, because Shiva is meditating just outside the city in the Himalayas. So on the way to Alaka, the cloud does meet Shiva. It worships Shiva, it meets his family, and there's definitely a sense, as the scholar Daniel Feller has noted, that the route that the cloud takes north can also be seen as a pilgrimage route, as a route in which, via which the Yaksha is also able to express his devotion to Shiva. And that was definitely picked up on by poets who composed Duta Kavyas after Kalidasa, and there's a whole range of strictly devotional messenger poetry where the sender, the devotee, sends their heart, their mind, a leaf, a bird to their beloved god who is residing either in the temple, or very often it's Krishna, and as he is playing in the forest with his gopis. As I mentioned at the very beginning, one of the most striking characteristics of the Meghduta, and I think the one that grips our imagination the most, is this madness that leads to the Yaksha addressing the cloud, an inanimate object. And I said that this is something which is acknowledged by the narrator of the poem, the poet, perhaps Kalidasa. It is acknowledged by the narrator, who has 5 introductory verses in the Meghduta. And the last of these verses reads as follows. Dhuma jyotih salila marutam samnipatah kvamegha samdesharthah kvapatukaranai pranibhih prapaniyah ityausukyat apariganayan guhyakastam yayache kamarta hi pranaya kripanash chetana chetaneshu. So we have a kind of question, a double question, kva kva, in this verse, which already leads us to feel this kind of discomfort, this doubt as to what is actually happening. So the first question is, but isn't a cloud, a megha, isn't a cloud just the combination of dhuma, jyotis, salila, and marut, of vapor, lightning, water, and wind? Isn't that a cloud? And then the second question is, the second kva asks, but isn't it only that creatures that breathe, prani pihi, that creatures that breathe and are able to speak are suitable for carrying a message? So we have this very clear dichotomy set up here, that on the one hand, we've just got this collection of lifeless elements. And on the other hand, we know, we, the readers, the narrator, everyone reading the poem knows that a sandesha, that a message can only be conveyed by someone who knows how to speak and by someone who is living, breathing, a sentient being. So that is the situation we're in, according to the poet. But iti, so iti kind of marks this end of that thought process, and we hear that actually the yaksha did not consider this at all in his excitement, and he entreated, he begged the cloud to take the message, because, and once again we have this arthantaranyasa, because those who are afflicted by love are naturally wretched in terms of being able to tell between what is sentient and that which is not, but between what is chetana and achetana. So this yaksha has lost his mind and therefore cannot make that distinction. Now, this is a very beautiful verse, very well known, I think, to most people who have read the Meghduta. It's the one that stays in our mind, I think, the longest, apart from the fact that it's very beautiful. The meaning is so impactful because it really sets the whole tone of the Meghduta as this extremely imaginative experiment that David Schulman has written about. What I want to contrast this verse with is a verse that is also 1.5 in another very famous messenger poem, and that is the Hamsa Sandesha by Vedanta Deshika, who lived in the 13th, 14th century of the Common Era in Tamil Nadu. And he is also, as I said, composing a Duta Kavya in which the messenger is a Hamsa, a swan in many English translations, or as I prefer, a goose. The bar-headed goose, to be specific. So this goose has been approached by the hero, and the hero here is Rama, and he is being entreated to take a message. Now, what has been noted by David Schulman and Yigal Bronner is that this is a very funny, in many ways, jibe at the Meghduta, because the Meghduta, as we know, the messenger doesn't make any sense. On the other hand, a Hamsa in Sanskrit literary convention, the Hamsa as a messenger makes a whole lot of sense, because these geese are extremely noble creatures. They are very intelligent. They are able to fly very, very long distances and very high up into the sky. They are also very discerning. As I'm sure you're aware, the Hamsa is able to filter milk mixed with water because it's so discerning. It's also very often used as a metaphor for Brahmins. So this is what happens when Rama approaches the Hamsa. Kritva tasmin bahumati masau bhuyasim anjaneyad gadho madah pranaya padavim prapa vartana pidnye vishleshena kshubhitamanasam meghashala drumadau yachnya dainyam bhavati kimutak api samvedanarthe. So first of all, if we just compare the verses, both are in the same exact spot in both poems, 1.5, the fifth verse of both respective poems, and there is a lot of overlap. The Hamsa Sandesha has taken quite a few ideas and actually verbatim words from the Meghduta, but the meaning is slightly different. It's slightly tongue-in-cheek. We know that Rama, as we said, Rama approached the goose and paid it great respect greater than he had even paid to Hanuman, Anjaneya. And the Rama was, of course, completely mad, but somehow he managed to find a way into the Hamsa's heart. So once again, we have this Arkantaranyasa, the same poetic ornament that we had in the Meghduta at the very same juncture. And the general truth that is being expressed here is that people who are maddened by separation, they end up begging clouds and mountains and trees, etc., Megha Shaila Drumado, to say nothing of living creatures. So there is the appearance of the cloud in this situation is actually quite meaningful, because Vedanta Deshika seems to be winking at us, telling us that this cloud is not, the original cloud messenger is not the ideal choice for this type of situation. It is a living being like the Hamsa, which is to be counted on instead of a cloud. But what I wanted to really bring your attention to here are the connections between the verses, and how the Meghduta really, its role as the foundational text cannot be overstated. And the last verse of the same type that I'd like to bring to your attention is from the Kokila Sandesha of Udanda Shastri. Kokila Sandesha, which was composed probably around the 16th, 17th centuries in Kerala. And here the Kokila is the Jacobin koku, also known as the kowl, and that word is extremely difficult for me to read. Here, where once again the messenger has changed. Now we've got a Kokila messenger, and that completely changes the whole tone of the poem, because what a Kokila is known for is being extremely promiscuous. That's one thing. And the second is that it is connected very, very strongly to the spring season in Sanskrit literary convention. So here we're not going to have that same type of separation that we had in the Meghduta, for instance, where the separation was very sorrowful and very painful. In the Kokila Sandesha, the separation is much more visceral and physical and kind of connected to that character of spring as it's presented in Sanskrit literature. So the hero says to the Kokila, he says, Vachalam ma parabhrita kritha mam priya viprayuktam prayah praptam pranaya vachanam tvadrisho madrishanam Hinchillinam hisalaya pute kokilam akulatma tvam cha pashyan batavirahinam yena janasitapam. So once again, we have the same type of vocabulary being used, but the poet or the protagonist is rather saying to the koku. So here I'm going to read the translation by Rajaraman and Kokamraju, who translate this as follows. Don't imagine, O Cole, that this is just the prattle of a man pining for his beloved. You're likely to lend a sympathetic ear to my appeal. If you lose sight of your mate deep within the foliage, even for a moment, you grow wild. So you know how terrible is the pain separation visits on lovers. So there's this idea here that, as usual in all Duta Kavyas, the messenger is some type of a extrapolation of the protagonist. He is very like the protagonist for obvious reasons, of course, and he is also the protagonist's very close friend. Whereas in the Meghduta, the cloud was going to take the message because it is part of Indra's lineage. It is a great and monumental, magnificent creature, I would say. The Hamsa was supposed to take the message because it's very noble and it always tries to do what's best for everyone else. In the Kokila Sandesha, the Kokila is going to take the message because it knows exactly what it's like to be separated from your lover in the springtime. So there are these layers that are always added to these poems as they were composed over time. And I think that's very important because most of the work that's been done on Duta Kavya in modern times tends to really emphasize the Duta Kavya tradition as a set of very often slavish imitations of the Meghduta, as if reusing vocabulary from the Meghduta or playing with its themes were somehow lazy. where in fact the whole point of writing a Duta Kavya seems to have been to write yourself, to write your literary prowess into this incredible tradition of messenger poetry that had been flourishing for so many thousands of years, like nothing else had in South Asia. So connecting your work to the Meghduta, as I said at the very beginning, was one of the most important things one could do when composing a Duta Kavya. The point was not to copy, the point was to find these points of connection and to somehow invert something of the Meghduta, to somehow play with it and make it more your own, while at the same time making sure that you're part of that immense literary tradition. So these are just some of the issues that come up when we study messenger poetry. Like I said, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of messenger poems, and each of them really does deserve its own treatment, both as a piece of literary work, but also as part of this huge Duta Kavya tradition. So we've only just scratched the surface of what the Duta Kavya genre has to offer, but I hope that I've got your interest and that you will be able to discuss this with me at our live interaction that we'll have for LHI Circle members very soon. And I look forward to seeing you then.